Welcome to episode 181 of the Campus Comics Cast, where we join JLApe-ril. And in this JLApe-ril, unfortunately, my first choice of comic, The Great Grape Ape, issue 1, was overruled by one Mr. Mike Atchison. I am the defeated Scott Reed, and joined on this episode by
Mike Atchison
and Shad Schubert.
And Mike, why don't you explain exactly what is going on in this episode?
Well, Scott, don't feel defeated. It was basically a lack of participation that led me to Swamp Thing Annual number 3, because I had a whole list of things, and if you'd have told me about the Great Grape Ape, I would have jumped on that one, because that's a great choice. But what we're dealing with here is that there's a group of podcasters that put together something called JL May every year, and it's usually and obviously sort of Justice League centric, but sometimes it also just kind of like broadens its horizon to other DC type events or titles or whatever. This year, Tim Price, one of the podcasters, came up with the idea of JLApe-ril. So I can't believe it wasn't thought of before, but it's a bit of a diversion from JL May, but it's really cool. And anybody that was around in the 90s buying DC books, late 90s, remembers that JL Apes crossover event where it was I think it was in the annuals of some of the major titles. And some of the podcasts that are participating other than us is Professor Allen from the Quarter Bin Podcast, who's doing Kong on the Planet of the Apes number 1. We got the Bat Pod, who's doing Batman Annual number 23. We have Coffee and Comics doing Wonder Woman 170, and that's volume 1. We've got Married with Comics doing JLA versus Kong versus Godzilla, very contemporary title. And we have Paul Hicks, someone we know from the show, doing Dial F from Flanger. Oh my goodness, I don't know, is it Flanger or Flanger? But anyway, that's one of his podcasts, and they're doing Strange Adventures 201. The Irredeemable Shag and Doug Zuisi are doing Once Upon a Geek. From Once Upon a Geek are doing The Helmet of Fate, Detective Chimp number 1. Tim Price is from The Outcasters, and he, along with Al Sedano, is doing Angel and the Ape numbers 1 through 4. And then Derek from the Fanholes podcast is doing Kongorilla 1 through 4 from 1992. You might notice that some of these titles, some of the characters are gonna appear in the book that we're covering too.
And what is the book that we are covering?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Scott. It is Swamp Thing Volume 2, Annual number 3. And if you remember, Volume 1 was the Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson book from the 70s, and Volume 2 was sort of, I forget which issue where Alan Moore took over. Was it like 19 or something?
I was going to say 22, but I will look that up while you are talking.
So this is the well-known volume of Swamp Thing where he really came to the fore, and just as well, I remember the headline was Sophisticated Suspense. Alan Moore's writing really just broke the mold, even before we seen Alan Moore on The Watchmen. So this book is out of what year was that? I think it's from 1987, July 28th, 1987. And it's written by Rick Veitch, who succeeded Moore as the writer. And Veitch
who started apparently on issue 20, because the previous writer, Pasco, ended on issue 19.
Oh, okay.
So it was between the two numbers we had.
So yeah, it was basically I don't know what they planned on. I think Len Wein maybe did some writing of the initial ones. It was called Saga of the Swamp Thing, I think, initially. But anyway, Rick Veitch he took over for Alan Moore at some point, and he had been doing the art, but he's doing the writing and the art, and he had some assists by Sean McManus and Jim Fern and Stan Walk, and the inks were done by Tom Yates or Yeats, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce that, and it was edited by Karen Berger. And what really stood out for me when I was trying to look for a gorilla or an ape themed book was this cover by Brian Boland. And it's basically depicts Kongorilla, the golden ape, eating what appears to be the remains of his human host, sometimes host or partner, Congo Bill. So very creepy, but in the typical Brian Boland excellent fashion.
Okay. Well, are we ready to dive in?
I think we are. Did you have a question for Chad?
Well, I guess one thing that we could talk about is what our remembrances are, if we have any, of Rick Veitch before or during this time. So, Mike, did you want to maybe talk about what you know about Rick Veitch?
Oh, this was the first I'd known of him. I remember him reading or writing a version or a volume of Aquaman later on, but this was the earliest. Swamp Thing was the earliest I'd ever heard of Rick Veitch. But he was a really good artist, and I think his writing's pretty good too.
Okay, Shad, what about you?
Mine was really just Swamp Thing. I kind of was thumbing through his bibliography and saw, there's quite a bit of things he had his hands in, but Swamp Thing's really where I recognize the name from.
I had a couple of things that I remembered him. I think these both predate Swamp Thing, but I could be wrong. My memory sometimes fails me more often than it helps me out. But the two things I remember him from was he did like a 3-issue run on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I want to say it was like in the issues like the 20s to the 30s. I can't remember the exact issue numbers, but it kind of took a more serious play on the Turtles at that time. Focusing on the ninjutsu stuff and samurai and the way of the warrior. I remember really, really enjoying it. And it's like I wasn't buying Turtles before. And then when he stopped writing it, I stopped buying Turtles. So I just bought those Rick Veitch issues just because Rick Veitch was on them. And then the other thing that I remember him from was the Brat Pack, which was like it's a mini series, one of those deconstruction of superhero series that were kind of going on at the same time as like Watchmen and some of the other titles of the time where they're taking a different look at heroes, the darker look. This is kind of post Frank Miller's Dark Knight. So I generally have a generally positive view, and then of course his run as artist on Alan Moore's Swamp Thing was also really, really good. So. All right, so I think we're going to dig into the issue, Distant Cousins, and I think how this is going to work is that we're going to kind of break up the synopsis, and then kind of in between Shad and I speaking, Mike's going to give us a little background on some of the characters that appear in that section. So, again, the title of this story is Distant Cousins. So we have Gorilla Grodd is being held as a prisoner in Gorilla City with a hypnotic device preventing him from using his mental abilities. Grodd is able to close one eye and weaken the hold the machine has over him. He is then able to use his telepathic abilities to take over the minds of intelligent gorillas around the globe and summon them to Africa. So, Mike, what do you got to tell us about? What are you going to tell us about Gorilla Grodd here?
Well, it's appropriate that he's sort of the lead into this story because he's probably the most well-known gorilla in the DC universe, and he's a villain. He's a Flash villain specifically. He first appeared in Flash 106, which is the second issue of the Silver Age, the resurgence of the Flash title, and it was in 1959. He was created by John Broome and Carmine Infantino. He's a hyper-intelligent, telepathic gorilla, able to control the minds of others. He originally was an average ape until an alien spacecraft, and I think this is retconned from a radioactive meteor, which I don't know that makes a difference. I think it has something to do with Hector Hammond originally, but it crashed in Grodd's African home. So Grodd gained these psionic abilities, and he's most known for just putting others under his mental control and transferring his consciousness into other bodies. He's telekinetic. He's able to do a lot of lifting with his brain, and he's just one of the forefront villains in the DC universe.
Shad, you want to take the next section?
Absolutely. Monsieur Malat is the first to be overcome. He turns against his longtime partner, the Brain, and kills several of the terrorists they have been working with.
All right. And Monsieur Malat is probably one of my favorite gorilla characters. One of my favorite characters or villains in the DC universe, period, because it's just visually it's just a cool look. He is a beret wearing gorilla, intelligent gorilla with a machine gun and a ammunition belt across his shoulder. So he's first appeared in Doom Patrol number 86 in 1964, created by Arnold Drake and Bruno Premiani. He's, like I said, he's super intelligent, carries the machine gun, and he was a charter member of the Brotherhood of Evil, which were the main enemies of the Doom Patrol.
So then Sam Simeon of Angel and the Ape is also affected. Seeming to lose his mind over a lack of artistic freedom from his editor, he kidnaps his partner Angel and then hijacks a plane.
Yeah, and Sam Simeon's he's an interesting character because he's meant to be in a humor book, Angel and the Ape. He and Angel first appeared in Showcase number 77 in 1968. They were created by E. Nelson Bridwell and Bob Oxner, and Sam originally hailed from Gorilla City. Actually, he's the grandson of Gorilla Grodd. I don't know if that's was always the continuity or if that was retconned later, but he's super intelligent, has force of mind capabilities, and at some point he was invited by Angel O'Day and her dad to move to New York, where he became an artist for DC Comics and assists Angel at her detective agency. A little bit on Angel. She's actually the sister of the inferior Five's Dumb Bunny. But she's not dumb at all. She's super intelligent and a great detective. So anyway, like I said, it's that whole skit. Just seeing Sam in this was interesting because he's different than the rest of them.
I got a couple of questions here. Well, comment and a question. I felt like they played up on the dumb bunny part of Angel in this story, just for the record. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
I think maybe originally she was meant to be sort of naive at the in her original iteration, but in the 90s, that series, she was not a dumb bunny at all. But you know how continuity is.
Yeah. And then E. Nelson Bridwell, I know I'm supposed to know that name from some other things, and I'm just drawing a blank, Mike. I know you would love to educate me on E. Nelson Bridwell.
He is the nerd of all nerds. He is the nerd that we all aspire to be. He's like the earlier version of, say, the Mark Wades and the Mark Grunwalds. He had an encyclopedic mind that the editors at DC would ask him some obscure question about a character, and he would say, yeah, that professor appeared in Superman number 147 and did this and that, and he was the continuity cop. He made sure that DC didn't step on its own toes with its writing. And some of the he wrote Super Friends for a lot of years. Okay. He wrote most of the Super Friends. He wrote a lot of backup strips like Mr. and Mrs. Superman and Superman Family. There's other ones I just can't think of, but yeah, he's just one of those guys that he was probably ridiculed. I've even read articles where he was kind of messed with, because he wasn't he was the pushing up the glasses guy and had the pocket protector maybe, but they definitely needed E. Nelson Bridwell at DC.
So Shad, what's going on with Buona Beast?
So in Africa, Juba, I think is how you pronounce this. Is the D silent? Okay.
I'd say, yeah.
The ape friend of Buona Beast attacks Mike Maxwell, stealing the Buona helmet, and leaves him in the jungle to die.
Yeah, and Buona Beast, very obscure character, probably the most obscure out of all of these, except for maybe one that's I don't want to spoil that's coming up, but Buona Beast just had this strange look. First of all, you can tell he's a character of the 60s because he's a white guy in Africa and he's got all these, he's like the white savior type thing. And
Yeah.
he first appeared in Showcase number 66 in 1967, created by Bob Haney and Mike Sikowski. And I don't know if the Juba actually appeared in the same that same issue, but Wannabe, his powers were to communicate with animals, and he could merge two of them together into more powerful creatures. And as we can talk about in our notes, he did that in this issue when he combined a couple of the animals to be able to serve his purposes. He's often assisted by this the Juba and her magical elixir, and when he retired, he was succeeded by and this all happened in like the Morrison Animal Man series in the 90s. He was succeeded by Freedom Beast, who was a South African man, and he was obviously African. And so yeah, that's the story on Buana Beast.
So elsewhere, Congo Bill is under pressure from his colleagues to take a television gig searching for the Swamp Thing in Louisiana. Bill refuses and decides to rub the magic ring one more time, switching consciousness with Congorilla one last time and planning never to switch back. Congo Bill, now with the mind of Congorilla, runs off to Gorilla City. Janu, Bill's former partner, follows to record the events.
Yeah, Congo Bill's outside of Gorilla Grodd probably the most known, even though you said earlier, Scott, I don't think you were as familiar with him or Congorilla, were you?
The next one is the one that I have no knowledge of. I'd heard of Congo Bill before.
Okay. Well, Congo Bill was the earliest of these characters in this book. His alter ego was William Glenn Morgan. He first appeared way back in More Fun Comics number 56, June of 1940, created by Whitney Ellsworth and George Papp. And then Congorilla did not appear until way later in 1959 in Action Comics number 248. He was created by Robert Bernstein and Howard Sherman, and it originally was, the original Congo Bill story or adventures were they were just basically an adventure strip. He was a safari guy, probably one of dozens that were like that in the comics back in the 40s. But then in Action Comics 248, he gained the power to swap minds and bodies with the Golden Ape Congorilla. And that's who we know these days mainly as the character. They can basically do the old Friday the 13th trick of switching, their minds and bodies. And there's been a lot of appearances of him over the years, even up until I remember I think the last thing I seen him in was Cry for Justice, Justice League miniseries by James Robinson.
All right, on to Gotham, Shad.
In Gotham Zoo, the gorilla boss escapes and makes his way to Gorilla City, all the while quoting lines from all the TVs and movies he's been watching over the years while he's been in prison.
So Gorilla Boss, like you, Scott, and I know you too, Shad, is the least known to me as well. I had heard of him, but I had not much knowledge beyond that. He, although he's kind of an interesting character from the story here, he first appeared in Batman number 75, 1953, created by David Vern Reed and Lou Schwartz. He was originally the mobster boss called George Boss Dyke and was executed in the gas chamber, but had his brain transplanted into the body of a gorilla. And I don't know if any of the stories back then had anything to do with what his character was like in this story.
You mean you haven't read all those?
No, the 50s Batman stories are something I probably would mostly avoid. Yeah.
All right, so back in the swamps of Louisiana, Grodd's mental summon reaches the Swamp Thing. Somehow he is able to affect the plant elemental also. Swamp Thing relives the death of Alec Holland, then disappears, where he reforms in Gorilla City as a giant, might I add, a giant green ape, and begins wrecking the city.
The mind-controlled
Yes.
apes reach gorillas. Oh, sorry.
No, I think I interjected too soon. Go ahead.
You're okay. The mind-controlled apes reach Gorilla City and release Grodd. When Grodd is freed, he confronts Solivar while Gorilla City burns. Grodd plans to give himself physical powers to rival his mental ones, while the magic waters given to him by Juba in combination with electromagnetic forces, Grodd believes that he will gain the power to rule the world. Instead, the electrical energy fries his brain cells, leaving him mindless. The apes are released from his control and return to their previous lives.
Yeah, so King Salivar is sort of the antithesis to Gorilla Grodd. He's the mirror image. He first appeared in Flash 106, which was like one issue after Gorilla Grodd's first appearance. Also created by John Broome and Carmen Infantino. He is or was the leader of the utopian Gorilla City until he was assassinated in Jail Annual number 3, which was the aforementioned JLApe crossover event. And he was, for anyone that's a Crisis fan, he was one of the Great 15 characters that were sported on the first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths. He was one of the characters gathered by the Monitor during the Crisis to protect the cosmic machines from the Anti-Monitor shadow demons, etc. Solivar was gravely injured while protecting the boy Commandy during this story, and basically they thought he was dead, but he was actually teleported back to Gorilla City, and he had his life saved. So he got better. But he was eventually assassinated, and I'm trying to remember what storyline that was in. I read it somewhere, but he died decades later, but also was temporarily resurrected in Blackest Night. So he's in and out of continuity.
Now, one of the things that's funny to me about this story is that it's a Swamp Thing issue, and we have said almost zero about Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
So there is, throughout the issue, this running storyline where basically Abby and Alec Holland, Swamp Thing, are having this little bit of a disagreement about the nature of their relationship. She doesn't like him, gallivanting around the world, and I guess she's just feeling left out or alone or wondering if he's too big for her or whatever the case may be. But as they're having this discussion, he then gets controlled by Grodd, and they never really explain how he's able to control a plant elemental, right? It just happens. And he basically, right before he disappears again, which is what they had just been talking about, he kind of relives his origin, and in fact even calls Abby by his dead wife's name. And it's like, oh, that's right, you're not Linda, you're Abby. Yeah. And then he once again disappears. So she is then stuck there back in the swamp while he's gone, and she's wondering, well, is he going to come back? And then at the end, whenever Grodd's mind kind of gets fried and Swamp Thing becomes himself again, he returns, and then of course Abby and Alec are able to reconcile their relationship and realize that they were both wrong in what they were saying. So it's kind of like this nice little touch. So you got the ape, you got the romance comics, all built into one annual.
That's right.
Swamp Thing.
And Swamp Thing books, at least in this volume, there was a lot of romance between him and Abby. It was a nice story. This, however, was a little bit forced, and it's like you said, it's like it was barely a Swamp Thing story. I mean, it was like almost like Rick Veitch at some point said, how in the world am I going to make this even fit into a Swamp Thing book? So I think most of us just left to accepting what he did and try to enjoy the rest of it, because the Swamp Thing parts really didn't jive.
Well, it's an annual. Yeah. So it's not part of like the regular stories. Most of the time, annuals, if they don't just cross over with other annuals, they're basically self-contained stories. So it's probably as good of a spot for this type of a story. It's probably just Rick Veitch wanted to tell an ape story, apparently. Now, that's my next question is, what do you feel like Rick Veitch is trying too hard to emulate Alan Moore after having taken over the book, or what are your thoughts on
Well,
that?
I'll take that a step further than emulating him. I read that in the letters pages of issue number 70, which was, I don't know how long after this annual, but it wasn't too long, there was a note from Karen Berger, the editor, and she indicated that the idea for this story came from Moore himself, but he departed the title before getting to use it as in an issue. So it's, I don't know if it was editorial that told Veach, hey, let's make use of this plot, and then Veach didn't. He executed it, but it wasn't maybe as good as Moore maybe would have executed it. I mean, Alan Moore is a hard act to follow for sure, but yeah, that's what I read. So I think that's why he did this story.
I don't want to. What I said, I don't want to in any way imply that Rick Veach is not a good writer, because he has had some very, very solid books. Like I said, those Turtles books, Brat Pack. I believe he did the series called The One from Epic. So he's got chops as a writer for sure.
Yes. Yeah, this one was like, it wasn't his original idea maybe, and that's what, I don't know. I just felt like it was a little disjointed in that way, but that was more than overwhelmed by the coolness of having a theme like this.
Is
all of
coolness the right word?
For me it is, because I'm cool that way. That's what makes it cool for me is it's kind of nostalgic. It lets me do some research because I like to research stuff, and it's got, I mean, it's a theme. It's a theme. So now, not everybody might agree with me, but that's what made me like it more than I didn't like it.
Do we know?
Research is a good word. Research, because it came preloaded with so much that I felt like you needed to know to follow along, including the characters that in an age pre-internet, if you were just picking up this one shot, you would not know what the heck was going on, I would imagine. With most of these, especially if you were just reading Swamp Thing and you didn't know the background of the 7 or 8, however many apes that are referenced in the story.
And even for me, I didn't know.
Question, which is, do we know how Grodd got into the predicament that he was in? Do you know what?
That was my question too.
Yeah, what story? Why was Grodd there to begin with? I mean, apparently he'd been there for 3 years, if I remember from the story. Did we remember what was the event 3 years prior that placed him in Gorilla City?
I'll say that I think there was a story that explained that, but because I read about it at some point during my quote unquote research, but I can't remember what it was. I'd have to go back to like Mike's Amazing World of Comics to look at the chronology of his appearances and see. But I'm almost certain I read that there was an actual story that showed how he was, captured or held at bay by Solivar in this, hypnotic trance where he couldn't break free, which is the only way you can really do something with Grodd because of his mental capabilities.
Do you feel like that this ability to project his mind across the entire planet is a little bit of an escalation of his power set? Mm-hmm. It feels like it was a little bit more than what Grodd was typically capable of.
Well, to consider that the fact that he could only open or close one eye over the course of these months or years, it took that much concentration to get to the point where he could control other gorillas. Yeah, I think that was a bit of a stretch, plot-wise. It's comics, but then again, even comics have limitations. So yeah, it'd have been better if there'd have been like somebody, if say the Ultra Humanite stumbled into Gorilla City where this guy was being held, and somehow Grodd picked up on that and partnered up with him, and then Ultra Humanite helped him, recruit, so to speak, the other ones. That's my own fan fiction. So
I did like in the Congorilla Congo Bill sequence how I think you had told me, Mike, that there was like a limit to the number of ape covers that DC would allow in a particular month, and they kind of are playing on that idea in that sequence with Congo Bill about how people want to see apes in their videos and their stories. So let's lean into that just a little bit.
Right. That was a good segment of the book. That was one of the better scenes where he's trying to be, Congo Bill at this point is in his 50s at least, and he's being pushed by some of his cohorts, or some of his colleagues. One of them was Roy Raymond, the TV detective. I thought that was kind of a callback to the old Action Comics strips. Roy Raymond was one of them because he's a TV producer or whatever, and on top of being a detective, maybe, I don't know. The Janu, this is the guy that's now grown, but when he was a boy, he was rescued by Congo Bill, and the boy, I guess, had been brought up by, in the jungle for years, and I forget who the other guy, I think, was maybe Roy Raymond's son or something, but I thought that was he was like fed up with them trying to push him into doing this TV spot, and he's like thinking to himself, maybe I'll just rub this ring one more time and throw the ring away. And that's kind of what he did. And he, it kind of worked with the story. I enjoyed that part.
So I just did a quick search, and actually Brat Pack, this annual came out in 1987, and Brat Pack was not released until 1990. So this had been released prior to the, I guess, quote unquote, discovering Rick Veitch. I'm trying to figure out whenever those Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles issues were. I'm trying to find the issue numbers there. But while I'm looking that up, now you could tell this was a late 80s story, that's for sure, because you've got Congo Bill. It basically implies that he's a murderer in that sequence. You've got you've got Sam Simeon basically bringing new meaning to Darn Dirty Ape. You've got the ethnicity of Buona Beast is kind of brought up, as an issue in that sequence. So there's that deconstruction of the quote unquote heroes, the heroic characters inside of this story, which I thought was interesting. Definitely a sign of the times, I guess.
In the when Sam Simeon's little spot is Sam. He's referencing. He's talking to his editor or the writer that he's ghostwriting for, and it's Stan. Is that supposed to be a punch at Stan Lee?
Ooh,
I don't know, but I'm not surprised. Except at this point, they don't say in this story that he's working for DC Comics. That's in something I've found on the internet that he was. But it would be really surprising if that's not what that was meant. That's not who that was meant to refer to.
That's because he was just like cursing the whole time and saying something about like, you need to find someone else to ghostwrite for you, Stan, and all this stuff. And I was like, this has to be a dig at Stan Lee.
Oh yeah, it was like the whole Grodd infecting his mind was kind of taking his thoughts and making them, it's kind of like the whole think, sober thoughts, drunk words. And everything he's been holding in about, being constrained by the editors, and he can't draw the way he wants to. And I'm an artiste. You're all, he's just going nuts. It's all kind of like focused on the way the company has kind of held him down. I just thought that was hilarious. And I liked how he was depicted. He wasn't like the other apes. He looked more like, almost like Java from the Teen Titans, or not Java. What was his name? Java the Cave Boy?
I don't know.
No, that's Java's from Metamorpho. Doggone, I'm trying to think of the one that was in the Teen Titans. Anyway, he's got sort of a humanoid look to him, not just exactly like a gorilla. So I like they depict it. That's the way he was done in the Angel and the Ape series.
Okay.
Let me check my notes here. See what other comments I have. Oh, okay. So the gorilla bosses, like movie references, like the first few times, it was just like for the people in the zoo, right? And I did dig the mission from Grodd play off of Blues Brothers.
Yes.
But man, by the time we get to the end, I was so sick of the movie references. It got old.
I thought he would stop at some point. I mean, when he did the what was it, Dragnet,
Yeah.
we were working the day shift out of missing persons. My partner's Janu. My name's Friday. I'm a cop. Dum da dum dum. I thought, okay, they're just taking this all away. I mean, that part I enjoyed it. It was a little bit of a humorous break from some of the
Yes.
stuff, but it was an interesting story. I mean, if you want to be a completist, you could say, well, why didn't they have, like I said earlier, Ultra Humanite in the story, or Titano, the super ape, the Superman villain? Could have been other ones that maybe
Detective
could have included.
Chip, or
Yeah, I mean, yeah, unless they were just going for the gorilla model and not any kind of ape. I'm not sure, but yeah.
And my last comment on this story, and it kind of ties into that whole late 80s deconstruction, but the relationship between Buona Beast and Princess was more than a little creepy.
Oh my goodness. I'm glad you said it, because I have my notes here, and I mean, it was so obvious. I mean,
yeah.
okay. It was weird. So
They were more than friends.
It was very, very odd. So yeah.
I guess that makes sense for more sense for Buona Beast, because he was such a oddball character anyway.
Okay, so I'm gonna go first on this one because I don't want you stealing mine. But we're gonna talk about like our favorite ape, great ape, whatever stories. And actually, if it had been my choice, and if you hadn't had poo-pooed what my suggestion would have been in your initial email, which would have been, if we're gonna do an ape story, then the greatest story that contains an ape is without a doubt Motor Girl, issues 1 through 10. So your namesake Mike, from Motor Girl, that is absolutely 100% the best ape story ever told. All right. And if you want to hear our thoughts on Motor Girl, you can go back to our archives and listen to episode 159, where we break down really the first 9 out of 10, because we don't want to spoil the ending. So we leave 10 up to the listener to actually go read. But we kind of cover the first 9 in fairly good detail. So
yes.
that's my absolute favorite ape story, and it's like none even can hold a candle to it as far as I'm concerned. So what about you, Mike? Do you have an all-time favorite ape story?
Well, favorite ape, I think I've said it, his name a couple times already, is the Ultra Humanite. And even though the Ultra Humanite started out in early issues of Action as a Superman foe, I want to say like issue 12 or something, he was basically a Lex Luthor. It was like a prototype Lex Luthor. He was kind of a balding mad scientist type. And then over time, he developed a way to transfer his brain into other beings. One of them was Dolores Winters, an actress in some of those Golden Age stories, where and it might have been, sometimes I forget if it's actually Golden Age or if it was in Roy Thomas's All-Star Squadron. So it might have been set in the 40s, but it didn't come out until the 80s. But he would take over other bodies, but eventually, and one of the best storylines ever in Justice League, where it was a JLA-JSA crossover, he was in the body of a white furred ape called the Ultra Humanite. But I don't remember the details on how he picked that ape as something to transfer his brain into, but it was visually stunning. It had George Perez doing the art, maybe the design on the character, and it's pretty intimidating. Some of the other ape ones are sometimes kind of corny, but this one was legit.
Shad, what about you? You got a favorite ape story, ape character?
Yeah, I was kind of looking through this, and I would say, not that he is the main character in the story, but I was always a big fan of Dr. Pogo, from the Umbrella Academy, who was he was the master of the house. He was the responsible adult with all of these kids, and Professor Hargreaves, who was a little bit all over the place himself. So the one responsible being in the midst of all of the chaos of the Umbrella Academy is this chimpanzee, this talking chimpanzee that kind of keeps everything in line. And I liked that kind of weird kind of thing there with that.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I did find the issues of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that Rick Veitch was both the writer and artist on, and that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles
Really?
issues 24, 25, and 26. And those are from October of, actually, that was the last one. That was 26. Let me go back to 24. So 24 would have been August of 1989, which puts it right around the same time as, let's see, because this was published in 1987, so actually a couple of years after this. So I did not realize that these books, that he was on Swamp Thing prior to the Turtles and Brat Pack. So because I didn't read Swamp Thing until the collected editions, for Alan Moore later on. I wasn't reading it.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely wasn't reading it early in the run. It was much later that I jumped on the Swamp Thing bandwagon with everybody else. So
But I do have to support your choice of favorite ape, even though that Mike's participation in this wouldn't have worked for reasons I don't want to say, because it would spoil that story if anyone wants to read Motor Girl. But easily the best ape, or best story involving an ape that I've ever read. Easily.
All right, good. I'm glad we're in agreement there. So all is forgiven for crushing my dreams of doing the Great Grape Ape as our book for this.
Well, you really need to scan the cover of that book into, Campus Comics Cast Facebook page.
I'll put it up there whenever we upload the episode. I'll be sure to include the Great Ape. Give everybody false hope that that's what we're actually going to talk about.
That's right.
Dash those hopes to pieces whenever we actually talk about Swamp Thing Volume 2. Now, are we going to grade this story like we normally do?
I wrote down a grade, so it's up to you all.
Okay, all right. So I'm gonna go. I got to decide if I'm gonna go last, because I probably should go first. I suspect I'm going to be the low man on the totem pole as usual with the grade. But Mike, why don't you go first?
I'm not real high. I'm a fine 6.0. Probably could have been lower, but the fine, what raised it for me was just seeing these other characters that you normally wouldn't see together. It's just a cool novelty type story. Even though it's not a Swamp Thing story at all, no matter what they tried to do to insert him into it. I thought it was cool seeing some of these characters. Some were better than others. So, yeah, fine 6.0.
All right, Shad, what about you?
Oh gosh, I feel like there's, like we said before, there's two stories to grade almost. There's the through line of Swamp Thing, and then there's the ape story. But as a whole, I think I'm gonna go with a 3.5, a very good minus on this one. It was not overly enjoyable for me as a whole. I think there were a couple of good parts, but as a whole story, it just fell flat for me.
All right. Well, for once, I'm actually not the low man on the totem pole. It actually makes me happy. So I'm actually right there with Mike at a fine 6.0. I guess I enjoy Rick Veitch's writing, even though I feel like he's trying a little bit too hard in some of the dialogue, especially on those Grodd pages, to really, really emulate more. I feel like he's trying to do there. Maybe not so much the rest of the book. But overall, it's kind of one of those, I would call it like a niche comic, which is, hey, we're talking about JLApe-ril, so this perfectly fits that. So if you're somebody who is into apes, this is definitely a book that you have to read. All right, it's got lots of apes. You get a good reminder about what these characters are about. At least the late '80s, early '90s version of these various apes. So overall, I don't regret reading it. I'm not adding this to my personal collection. I'm not running out and buying a nice graded copy like I do with a lot of the books that I really really love. But I'm okay with a fine 6.0 for a kind of a one and done story here about apes. So
Yeah.
All right. Well, is there anything else anybody wants to add before we wrap this up?
One little comment, then I just wanted to mention that what really put me on a positive note as I opened this up, the very first page, because I have the physical copy, there's a meanwhile column by Dick Giordano, and I was surprised that he was still putting these out in 1987. I used to love reading these little editorials by him. And then secondly, I just want to thank Tim Price and everybody that puts the work into organizing these little crossover events. They're a lot of fun. So kudos to him.
Right. And then, Mike, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, you can, of course, email all of us at podcast@bergcomics.com. But who else? Where else could they get a hold of you at?
Well, if you want to reach me on X, it's Mike Atchison5. And if you want to reach me by email, the best way is m.atchison90@gmail.com.
All right. And Shad, what about you?
You can find me best on Facebook, and that is ShaadSchubert.
And I'm Scott Reed. You can find me at bergcomics.com, BURG comics.com, with links to my social media and also to my eBay store. And thank you to the JLApe-ril group for including the Campus Comics cast. And we'll be back soon with another episode.
Celebrating the tradition of apes in comics. For 2024, Gorilla Grodd has transformed JL May into JLApe-ril, exploring a phylum of amazing apes, such as
Batman Annual number 23,
Wonder Woman number 170,
Kong on the Planet of the Apes, issue 1,
Angel and the Ape,
The Helmet of Fate, Detective Chimp,
Showcase number 77,
JLA vs. Godzilla vs. Kong,
Swamp Thing Volume 2, Annual 3,
Kongorilla issues 1 through 4,
with a host of podcast all-stars like
The Bat Pod,
Resurrections, an Adam Warlock and Thanos podcast,
Outcasters, a Batman and the Outsiders podcast,
Dollar for Flanger,
the Quarter Bin Podcast,
Coffee and Comic,
Once Upon a Geek,
Fanholes Podcast,
Married with Content with John and Maggie,
Campus Comics Cast,
and many more. Look for the hashtag JLApe-ril 2024 on social media, the podcast crossover event that doesn't monkey around.
JLApe-ril, 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 JLApe-ril.
Damn dirty ape!
Monkey around? Really?
So what I'll do is I've got the list of the other podcasts that are doing this. I'll do that right after your intro. I'm just going to say this is we're participating in this JLApe-ril. I'll just lead you into it. So I'll say, Mike, explain what we're doing, and I'll set you up that way. So explain this nonsense to the listeners. Don't say nonsense. You might offend someone. They're very temperamental. Okay, all right. We'll never be asked back again. Well, then I probably should not participate in this episode. Oh, no, you can be you. I'm just kidding. You cannot like it, that's for sure, but don't. It's so. Whatever. It's goofy as hell. You should hear the promo. I'm like,